On a quiet night in Arlington, Texas, a 16-year-old girl found herself alone in an apartment that was usually full of family noise, laughter, and movement. But that night, it was still. She didn't know that while she sat inside, someone was already on their way to her door. Not looking for her, not even knowing her name, but coming all the same. She didn't know that decisions made by others, choices she had no part in, were about to collide with her life in a way no one could take back. She didn't know that the knock she heard was meant for someone else. All she knew was the quiet rise of fear in her chest and the sound of voices outside demanding to be let in. What happened in the moments that followed would change everything. For her family, for the men who came looking for revenge, and for a justice system that would spend decades holding the people responsible accountable. This is Timeline Unfolded. And this is the story of a girl who opened a door she never should have had to face alone. Her name was Lisa René. Before anything else, before the knock at the door, before the fear, before the violence that would follow, Lisa was simply a 16-year-old girl trying to build a better future. She was born in the U.S. Virgin Islands in 1978, the youngest in a big Afro-Caribbean family that loved her deeply. When her family moved to the mainland United States, Lisa moved with them, first to Florida and later to Arlington, Texas, so she could grow up surrounded by people who cared about her. Those who knew her described her the same way again and again: quiet, polite, always respectful. A girl who smiled easily, a girl who stayed out of trouble, kept to her books, and believed in the power of education. She lived at the Polo Run apartments with her siblings, including the brothers she adored, and spent most of her time doing the things any hopeful teenager does: schoolwork, music, time with family, and dreaming about what life might look like years down the road. And she had plans. Real, serious plans. Lisa wanted to become a doctor, a dream she held onto with determination her teachers and friends always noticed. Her teachers described her as hardworking and focused. Her friends remembered her as sweet, gentle, and never the type to be caught up in anything messy or dangerous. Lisa's world was school, family, and a future she was just beginning to imagine. She had nothing to do with drugs, violence, or the secrets moving silently around her. She was, in every sense of the word, innocent. And that innocence is what makes what happened next so devastating. To understand why strangers showed up at Lisa Renée's door, you have to go back 3 days, to a moment she knew nothing about. While Lisa spent her days focused on school and family, her older brothers, Neil Renee and Stanfield Vitalis, were moving in a very different world. A world of small, fast drug deals in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. A world Lisa wasn't part of and didn't know the details of, but a world that would soon reach her. That world stretched from Texas to Pine Bluff, Arkansas, where a man named Orlando Hall ran a marijuana trafficking operation with a network of young men who helped him move product. Hall relied on Texas contacts to buy bulk marijuana and send it back to Arkansas for profit. One of those contacts was Stephen Beckley, a 22-year-old from Irving. His role was simple: find local dealers, buy the marijuana, and connect Arkansas money to Texas suppliers. And that, according to federal court records, is how the Renee brothers entered the picture. Neil and Stanfield were known in certain circles as local dealers who could source marijuana fast, so when Orlando flew into Texas on September 21, 1994, Beckley brought him straight to them. They met at a car wash in Dallas, a quiet, neutral spot where deals happened without attention. There, Orlando handed Neil and Stanfield $4,700 in cash and told them to return with the product. But they didn't return. They disappeared instead. When Orlando called to ask what happened, the story shifted. Neil and Stanfield claimed they had been robbed, that someone had taken the money and even stolen their car. But Hall wasn't the kind of man who trusted excuses. The story didn't sit right with him. So he began making calls himself. One of the phone numbers he had been given led directly to the Polo Run apartments in Arlington, where Lisa lived with her family. Hall wanted the truth, so he and his crew drove to the complex, and that's when everything snapped into focus. They watched Neil and Stanfield walk out of the apartment and climb into the same car they claimed had been stolen. The robbery wasn't real, the story was a lie, and in Hall's world, lies were not tolerated. To him and his associates, the message was clear. They had been cheated, disrespected, set up, and what they wanted now was payback, money, or blood. But Hall didn't know the most crucial detail. Neil and Stanfield weren't always home. Their schedules changed. Family members came and went, and Hall had no idea who might be inside the apartment when he returned. He didn't know Lisa. He didn't know she lived there. He didn't know she spent her nights quietly doing homework while her brothers drifted in and out. He only knew one thing. He wanted the men who took his money. So a decision was made. Hall and his crew would go back. They would confront whoever answered the door, and they would reclaim what they believed they were owed. That choice, made far from Lisa, in a life she had never been part of, became the spark that ignited everything that followed. That moment when someone else's secrets began moving toward the last person who deserved to pay for them. September 24th, 1994. A Saturday night like any other at the Polo Run Apartments in Arlington. Inside one of the units, a 16-year-old girl sat alone. Her family came and went often, but that night, the apartment was unusually quiet. Her brothers were out, her sister wasn't home, and Lisa, as she often did, stayed inside, safe, focused, waiting for everyone to return. She had no way of knowing that the men looking for her brothers had already made up their minds. No way of knowing they had driven back from Dallas. No way of knowing they were walking toward her door. It began with a knock, firm, direct. Lisa approached the door but didn't open it. The voices on the other side demanded she let them in, claiming authority they didn't have, insisting they needed to speak to the men who lived there. Something felt wrong, deeply wrong. Lisa stepped back. She grabbed the phone. She called her sister first, and then, terrified, she called 911.
Who are you?
I'm the FBI.
Oh, they're the FBI.
Open the door. No, we talk.
They're the FBI. They said they're the FBI, ma'am. No! Ma'am? What's going on? Ma'am?
As Lisa begged for help, the men outside grew more aggressive. They kicked at the front door, trying to force it open, but the lock held, so they moved around the building to the back patio area, a sliding glass door that offered far less protection than the front. Lisa didn't see them break in. She only heard the crash, glass shattering, footsteps rushing inside. What she feared was now happening. The men weren't after her. They were looking for her brothers, but Lisa was the one standing in their way. Before help could arrive, they grabbed her, dragged her out of the apartment, forced her into a car waiting outside, and then they were gone. By the time officers reached the door, Lisa had already been taken, pulled into a world she had never been part of, a world she had spent her whole life avoiding. That night became the point of no return. A knock meant for her brothers had become a nightmare for Lisa, and the road she was forced onto next would take her far from Arlington, into the hands of men who believed someone had to pay for the $4,700 they lost. When Lisa was dragged out of her apartment, she wasn't taken by one man, she was surrounded by four. Orlando Hall, the leader of the Arkansas trafficking crew. Bruce Webster, the enforcer who broke into her home. Demetrius Hall, Orlando's 19-year-old brother. And Stephen Beckley, the Dallas-Fort Worth contact who helped them buy drugs in Texas. They weren't expecting to find Lisa that night. They were looking for her brothers. But Lisa was the one who ended up in their hands, scared, crying, and completely alone. They forced her into Orlando's sister's car, the same car they had used to drive to Polo Run. Lisa was shoved into the back seat, pressed between the men, begging them to let her go. Court testimony confirms that in that first car, as they pulled away from Arlington and headed toward Irving, Orlando sexually assaulted her. Lisa cried and pleaded, saying she didn't know anything about the money her brothers took. She said she didn't know where they were. She said she didn't understand what was happening. But the men didn't stop. They kept driving. Every streetlight that passed outside the window was a reminder that she was being taken farther and farther from safety. Their first stop was Irving, Texas, at an apartment belonging to Orlando's sister. a location the group had used before when moving drugs or meeting contacts. There, Orlando made a strategic decision. He moved Lisa out of his sister's car and into Stephen Beckley's car. It was deliberate. Beckley's vehicle was less recognizable, safer to move across states, easier to hide, and it placed Lisa with 3 men who would continue the assault during the long drive. The lineup in the second car was: driver, Stephen Beckley; passenger seat, Demetrius Hall; back seat, Bruce Webster; floorboard back area, Lisa. Lisa was put onto the floorboard, crying, terrified, trying to make herself small. She was 19 hours from home now. As they left Irving and pulled onto the interstate heading north, the fear didn't stop. The assault didn't stop either. Federal court testimony confirms Beckley sexually assaulted Lisa during the drive. Demetrius also assaulted her while Bruce was present. Lisa cried throughout. Lisa kept begging them to stop. She kept telling them she had nothing to do with her brother's drug deal. But the car didn't slow. The men didn't listen. Texas disappeared behind them as they crossed into Arkansas. Every mile of that dark highway carried Lisa farther from help, farther from home, and farther into the control of men who believed someone had to pay for the lie her brothers told. Near dawn, they reached Pine Bluff. There, they met with Marvin Turk Holloway, another member of the trafficking operation. Holloway wasn't in Texas during the abduction, but now he helped secure money for a place to hide. They checked into a low-cost motel, the kind of place where no one asked questions. To avoid suspicion, Lisa was forced to walk in holding Beckley's hand, pretending she was his girlfriend. Her voice was quiet, her body shaking, her eyes swollen from crying. Inside the room, the men tied her to a chair. For nearly 2 days, Lisa sat in that room, exhausted, terrified, hearing them discuss her brothers, the money, and whether she could identify them. During this time, the assaults continued. The fear of being isolated in another state with men who had already hurt her. The fear of not knowing if anyone was coming. The fear of hearing them talk about her future in front of her, as if she wasn't even human. Back in Texas, Orlando wasn't finished. He cleaned up loose ends, then took a commercial flight to Arkansas. Straight to the motel where they were holding Lisa. When Orlando walked into the room, Lisa was tied to the chair. She had been assaulted, threatened, moved across state lines, and held captive for hours. What happened next was one of the most pivotal moments in the case. Orlando led Holloway and Lisa into the motel bathroom. They stayed inside for 15 to 20 minutes. No one else heard what happened. But when Orlando came out, the look on his face told the others everything. And then he said the words that sealed Lisa's fate. She knows too much. In that moment, the question was no longer if Lisa would be allowed to live. The question, in the minds of the men who took her, became how she wouldn't. Lisa had done nothing wrong. She had no role in her brother's decisions. But for nearly 2 days she endured the unthinkable: fear, isolation, and assault at the hands of men who believed her silence was their only way out. And now, in a motel hours from home, she faced the terrifying truth: they weren't planning to let her go. While Lisa was being driven deeper into the night, something very different was unfolding back at the Polo Run Apartments. A story that began just minutes after she disappeared. When Arlington officers reached the unit, the door was cracked from repeated kicks. The back patio door was shattered inward, glass scattered across the floor. Furniture was knocked over. Her shoes were still by the couch. Her schoolwork was still on the table. Nothing suggested she had walked out on her own. One officer later said the scene felt like a struggle with no one left behind to explain it. They replayed her 911 call. The panic in her voice, the fear, the urgency. This wasn't a runaway. This was a forced abduction. When Lisa René and Stanfield Vitalis arrived back at the complex, officers asked the obvious questions. Did they know anyone who might want to harm Lisa? Did they owe anyone money? Had they been threatened? Were they involved in anything dangerous? But the brothers avoided eye contact. Their answers were short, vague, inconsistent. Detectives felt it immediately. They weren't being honest. Officers knew Lisa was in danger, but the two people who might know why weren't giving them the truth. What the brothers didn't admit: the $4,700 drug deal, the lie about being robbed, the stolen car that wasn't stolen, and the dangerous men from Arkansas they double-crossed. Their silence wasn't just suspicious, It was devastating. In a kidnapping, the first hours are everything. They determine search zones, roadblocks, alerts, and jurisdiction. But with no motive, no suspect names, no vehicle description, no direction of travel, no confession from the brothers, and no one telling the truth, detectives were left staring at a violent crime scene with no map to follow. They knew Lisa hadn't run away. They knew she had been taken. But they had no idea she was already miles outside their reach. By midnight, relatives filled the parking lot, crying, demanding answers, pleading with officers to treat this as an abduction. The police already were. They just didn't have the information they needed. Officers finally told the family something no one wanted to hear. With what we found inside that apartment, someone took her, and they took her fast. As hours passed with no leads, Arlington investigators reached out to the FBI. A teenage girl taken by force, cross-state movement likely, a 911 call documenting the break-in, and suspects unknown. The case met every requirement for federal jurisdiction. Agents began reviewing phone activity, travel routes, and interstate connections, unaware that Lisa was now tied to a chair in a motel room 300 miles away. As detectives questioned the brothers in Texas, Lisa was questioning whether anyone would find her in Arkansas. As officers studied footprints in broken glass, Lisa was listening to footsteps outside her motel door. As police tried to get the truth, the men holding her were deciding what her future would be. Two timelines moving at the same time, one desperately trying to find her, the other deciding whether she would ever be found. And within hours, those two timelines were about to collide in the worst possible way. While investigators in Texas were still trying to piece together what happened inside Lisa's apartment, in Arkansas, the men who had taken her were making plans of their own. Inside the Pine Bluff motel room, Lisa sat tied to a chair, exhausted, terrified, and far from anyone who could help her. It had been nearly 2 days since she was taken from Arlington. 2 days of begging to go home. 2 days of believing someone might still find her. But outside that motel room, the men were no longer talking about money. They were talking about what to do next and how to walk away without being identified. According to federal court records, on the night of September 25th, Orlando Hall left the motel with at least one accomplice and drove to a wooded park area just outside Pine Bluff. There, under cover of darkness, they dug a hole, a grave. They returned to the motel before dawn. On September 26, the group drove Lisa out of the motel for what they claimed was another location. The sun was barely up. The air was cold. Lisa didn't know where they were taking her. She didn't know what they had planned, but she kept asking if she could go home, kept promising she didn't know anything about the money, kept pleading for her life. They drove until the road faded into woods. Then they stopped. When they reached the general area, the men realized they couldn't find the hole they dug the night before. The darkness, the trees, the winding paths, everything looked different in the morning light. They walked back and forth searching, frustrated, talking quietly among themselves. Lisa stood among them, scared and shivering, not understanding why they were there or why they were searching the ground. Unable to find the grave, they brought her back to the car, back to the motel, back to uncertainty. Later that same morning, they tried again. This time, they found the grave. Federal evidence shows what happened next with calm, clinical clarity, the way investigators wrote it to avoid emotion. But behind those clean sentences is the truth of what Lisa lived through. The men placed a sheet over her head. Orlando Hall struck her with a shovel. She screamed, tried to run. The others caught her, held her, and beat her again. They poured gasoline on her clothing, then pulled her into the hole and began covering her with dirt while she was still alive. The medical examiner would later confirm what the evidence already showed. Lisa Renee's official cause of death was asphyxiation. She died from the dirt packed over her face. She was buried alive. Back in Texas, while Lisa lay in that shallow grave, the FBI was piecing together fragments of the brothers' withheld information. Phone records, associates, known drug contacts, Arkansas connections. By the time federal agents learned the names, Hall, Webster, Beckley, and Holloway, Lisa was already gone. The two timelines that had been separated by distance, one of investigators trying to find her, the other of men deciding to silence her, finally collided, just not in time to save her. Lisa's final hours were shaped by decisions she never made, men she never knew, and a lie she didn't tell. But her story wasn't over, because within days, the men who thought they had buried the truth would leave behind a trail investigators could finally follow. For 2 days after Lisa disappeared, the investigation stretched across state lines. What began as a frantic search in Arlington had quickly become a federal case involving multiple agencies, each trying to retrace the path she never chose to take. But while the men who kidnapped Lisa believed they had buried the truth in a remote patch of Arkansas woods, the trail they left behind was already unraveling. Back in Texas, investigators finally obtained the piece of information they had desperately needed: the names of the men connected to the $4,700 drug deal. Once Orlando Hall and Stephen Beckley came up, everything changed. Phone records began lining up, addresses, known associates, connections between Arlington and Pine Bluff. And when the FBI traced movement between the two cities that matched the timeline of Lisa's disappearance, their focus locked onto Arkansas. Federal agents, Arkansas law enforcement, and Pine Bluff police joined forces. They retraced the routes the men were known to use. They checked motel records. They interviewed witnesses who had seen a young girl checking in with Beckley. And then the big break came. A witness placed Orlando, Webster, Beckley, Demetrius, and Holloway together in the Pine Bluff area on the exact days Lisa vanished. From that moment, the search shifted from where she went to where they had been. On September 30th, 1994, investigators reached a wooded area near a park outside Pine Bluff. It was quiet, remote, thick with brush. Agents fanned out, walking slowly, searching for disturbed earth, footprints, tire tracks, anything. It didn't take long. They found a patch of ground where the soil had been recently turned. A shallow, uneven mound. The kind that stands out to investigators trained to read landscapes, like pages in a book. When they began to examine it more closely, their worst fears were confirmed. Just days after she was taken, just miles from where she had spent her final hours, Lisa René was recovered from the grave the men had dug for her. She was still wearing the clothes she had been taken in. There was no mistaking what had happened, no question that she had suffered, and no time left to save her. Everything her family feared, everything investigators had raced against, had already happened before the first report was even filed. One seasoned investigator later said, "There wasn't one agent or officer on that scene who didn't feel the weight of what we found." Lisa's remains were taken into custody by the medical examiner. Her family was notified. The grief that had been building in Arlington became unbearable reality. But for law enforcement, discovery meant one more thing. They now had a homicide, a body, a grave, physical evidence, travel paths, motel records, witness statements, and the names of every man involved. The case was no longer a race against time. It was a race toward justice. Lisa had been found, and with her the truth the men tried to bury. The next step, the one they believed they would avoid, was waiting in a federal courtroom. By the time Lisa René was found, the case had already grown far beyond Arlington, Texas. This wasn't just a kidnapping. It wasn't just a murder. It was a crime that crossed state lines. A federal offense with the full weight of the United States government behind it. And when the men responsible were arrested, they stepped into a courtroom they never expected to face. Not a local judge, not a state prosecutor, but the federal government. The case was tried in the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Texas, in Fort Worth, because Lisa had been kidnapped, transported across state lines, sexually assaulted, and killed during the course of that kidnapping. The charges carried the gravest penalties possible, including the federal death penalty. The defendants were brought in one by one. Orlando Cordia Hall, the ringleader; Bruce Webster, the enforcer; Demetrius Hall, Orlando's younger brother; Stephen Christopher Beckley, the driver and Texas contact; Marvin Turk Holloway, the man who helped finance and facilitate parts of the crime. But before jurors ever heard the charges, they heard something else: the 911 call. Lisa's voice, her fear, her plea for help. Prosecutors wanted the jury to understand exactly what kind of innocence had been stolen. Prosecutors portrayed Orlando not as someone reacting in anger, but as the deliberate leader of a trafficking operation, a man who had orchestrated every major decision that led to Lisa's death. They laid out his movements, flying into Texas for the drug deal, tracking down the brothers at Polo Run, ordering the break-in, initiating the sexual assault, flying back to Arkansas, and ultimately leading Lisa to the gravesite. The jury saw Orlando as the architect of the entire chain of events, and when they discovered he had already been involved in violent drug trafficking back in Arkansas, a background the court allowed in limited form to establish leadership and intent, it further solidified the prosecution's argument. He was convicted on every count. Bruce Webster's role was undeniable. He broke into the apartment. He tackled Lisa. He was present for every stage of the crime. He was physically strong, larger than the others, and prosecutors emphasized how he used that strength. But during sentencing, the defense brought up something the jury had not heard earlier. Bruce Webster had a documented history of childhood trauma and intellectual disability. Evidence showed he grew up in a severely abusive household. Court filings describe his father beating him and his siblings with belts, hoses, cords, and inflicting other physical and sexual abuse that left permanent scars. Multiple family members testified about the violence, instability, and dysfunction inside the home. Psychologists evaluated him and found long-standing cognitive impairments, with IQ scores placing him in a significantly impaired range. This history did not erase his guilt, but under federal law, it mattered for his punishment. The jury sentenced him to death anyway. Years later, however, after new evaluations and court reviews, federal judges ruled that Webster met the legal definition of intellectual disability, making his execution unconstitutional. His sentence was converted to life in federal prison, where he remains today. Demetrius was just 19, a follower, not a leader. In court, he came off as someone pulled into his older brother's world, but prosecutors reminded the jury that youth does not erase responsibility. He helped break in. He helped restrain Lisa. He assaulted her. He participated in the transport across state lines. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Demetrius accepted responsibility through a plea agreement, which helped him avoid the death penalty. He received a lengthy federal prison sentence. He was eventually released on August 2, 2016. Beckley's testimony became one of the most powerful elements of the trial. The jury heard how he drove the car, how he delivered Lisa to the motel, how he acted under Orlando's direction. But they also heard something else. Beckley cooperated. He led investigators to the gravesite. He testified against Orlando. He admitted his role in the assaults. His cooperation spared him the death penalty, but not punishment. He was sentenced to federal prison. Beckley was eventually released on April 21, 2020, after serving decades. Holloway wasn't in Texas during the abduction. He didn't break into the apartment, but he helped in ways that mattered. He provided money. He helped rent the Pine Bluff motel room. He supported the operation from Arkansas. His role was enough for significant federal charges, but not enough for the death penalty. He served a long federal sentence, then was released on May 2, 2008. The courtroom was silent as the verdicts were read. Lisa's family was present. Her sister cried quietly. Her relatives held hands tightly enough to leave marks. A federal prosecutor later said, "Lisa did nothing to deserve what happened to her." This verdict was the only measure of justice the law could provide. On November 19, 2020, after 25 years of appeals, Orlando Cordia Hall was executed by lethal injection at USP Terre Haute, the first African-American man executed by the federal government in nearly 70 years. By 2025, only Webster remains incarcerated. Hall is executed. The others are free. The courtroom did what it could. The sentences were handed down. The appeals ran their course. But justice, real justice, is complicated, because no number of years, no verdict, no execution could return the life Lisa should have lived. And the story wasn't only about the men who took her. It was also about the people who loved her and the brothers who never stopped carrying the weight of what they set in motion. When the courtroom finally emptied and the verdicts were spoken into record, the law had done what it could. But for Lisa's family, the end of the trial didn't feel like closure. It felt like the beginning of a life they never asked for, one built around grief, guilt, and questions that would never have real answers. Lisa's mother, siblings, and relatives had sat through every excruciating detail. the 911 call, the break-in, the transport, the evidence from Arkansas. Her sister testified about Lisa's dreams, how she wanted to be a doctor, how she loved school, how she smiled even on the hardest days. In statements to the court, family members described her as the center of their home, the quiet light everyone could depend on. Her absence didn't fade with time. Family members have expressed that the loss settled into their lives like a shadow, something always present, even in moments meant to be joyful. In the courtroom, her brothers sat silently. They weren't charged in Lisa's case. They didn't face trial for her death. But they carried something heavier than any sentence, the knowledge that the decision they made to steal the $4,700 set the chain reaction in motion. During Orlando Hall's sentencing, Stanfield Vitalis stood and told the court, "If I had gone straight to the police, maybe Lisa would still be alive." It wasn't a legal confession. It wasn't evidence. It was grief, raw, unfiltered, and permanently attached to the history of this case. After the trial, the brothers' lives forked. Neil Nick Renee served federal time on an unrelated drug case in 1995, and years later resurfaced in a major trafficking investigation, receiving a long federal sentence in 2013. Stanfield Vitalis, who received probation on separate drug charges, disappeared from public record. His later life remains private. The justice system punished them for their own crimes, but the punishment they carried for Lisa was something no courtroom could deliver. Agents and officers who worked the case in Arlington, Pine Bluff, and at the federal level have spoken about the impact it left on them. Many described Lisa's discovery as one of the most difficult scenes of their careers. One investigator later reflected that the hardest part was knowing they had found her, but too late to save her. For law enforcement, this case became a reminder of how fast a crime can escalate, and how the smallest delay, the smallest lie, the smallest decision can change the outcome forever. In the middle of this story, the arrests, the trials, the headlines, it's easy to lose sight of who was at the center of it all. Lisa Renee wasn't a statistic. She wasn't a case file. She was a 16-year-old girl who loved school, loved her family, and believed her future was bigger than anything around her. She deserved the chance to grow up, to grow older, to grow into the woman she dreamed of becoming. And the tragedy of her story is not only what was done to her, but what was taken from her. Her life was cut short because of decisions she never made, choices she never knew about, people she never met. And it's a reminder that sometimes the choices we make don't just shape our own lives. They ripple outward, touching the people we love in ways we never see coming. And sometimes the most devastating consequences are the ones that fall on the innocent long after someone else's mistake is made. Lisa's family still remembers her as bright, gentle, steady, a girl who worked hard, smiled easily, and believed in possibility, a girl who should still be here. And long after this case faded from the news, long after the courtroom doors closed, her name continued to echo through every appeal, every sentence, every file. Because she mattered, because her life meant something, because her story didn't end where they tried to bury it. This is Timeline Unfolded, where every life, every truth is brought to light.